Ford has always been a company that pushed boundaries, sometimes too far. Over the decades, it produced dozens of experimental vehicles, prototypes, and limited-run models that never made it to dealerships. Some were banned by government safety regulations, others by Ford executives who feared lawsuits or bad press, and a few were simply too powerful or impractical for the public. Here are 10 banned Ford cars that were built but never officially released.
Dear viewer, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for your support.
Number 10. The 1970 Mercury Cyclone Spoiler II. This car, while stunning to behold, never really had a chance to fulfill its intended destiny because of the sanctioning body's rulebook. Let's break down why it mattered and why it was effectively banned almost as soon as it was born. To set the stage, let's remember what was happening in late 1960s NASCAR. The late 1960s were the era of speed escalation. Manufacturers were locked in a battle not just to sell cars in showrooms, but to prove dominance on America's superspeedways. Ford, Dodge, Plymouth, and even Mercury were pouring engineering resources into aerodynamic tricks. They were stretching body panels, adding pointed nose cones, tucking in grills, and experimenting with flush designs that cut through the air far more efficiently than boxy stock sedans. Ford had already made headlines with the 1969 Tarinum Talladega, and its Mercury cousin, the Cyclone Spoiler II, followed quickly behind. The goal was the same: take a production car, rework the nose and front end, and give racers a machine that could dominate the competition at Daytona and Talladega. The Cyclone Spoiler II featured an extended, sloped nose that was several inches longer than the standard Cyclones. It also had a flush-mounted grille, narrower front track width, and smoothed body sides, all engineered with one purpose in mind: minimize drag and maximize speed on high-banked ovals. Now, here's the catch. NASCAR had always insisted on a stock car identity, meaning that the race cars had to be closely related to production vehicles. Ford and Mercury were clever. They built just enough Spoiler IIs to satisfy homologation requirements, so they could legally enter them in NASCAR competition. But once these cars hit the track, it was clear they were game changers. Their aerodynamic advantage made them practically unbeatable in certain conditions. The extended noses gave them a significant edge in top-end speed, and suddenly the sport looked less like stock car racing and more like a futuristic arms race. NASCAR officials grew increasingly uneasy. On one hand, fans loved the spectacle. On the other hand, the speeds were climbing to dangerous levels, and the technology gap between showroom stock and race car special was widening. By 1970, the sanctioning body drew a line. They implemented new rules that outlawed these extreme aerodynamic specials, capping engine displacement for aero cars and tightening homologation requirements. This effectively sidelined the Mercury Cyclone Spoiler II after only a brief moment in the spotlight. The irony is that the Cyclone Spoiler II was one of the most radical and advanced cars Mercury ever put on the road, yet it became obsolete almost immediately. NASCAR's aero ban meant that Ford and Mercury's investment was essentially wasted. Production numbers were extremely limited, making it one of the rarest muscle-era NASCAR homologation cars today. So, what's the legacy of the 1970 Mercury Cyclone Spoiler II? It symbolizes the peak and abrupt end of Detroit's aerodynamic one-upmanship on the stock car circuit. For collectors, it's a holy grail, a reminder of how far the manufacturers were willing to push the envelope before NASCAR stepped in to slow the arms race down. In the end, the Spoiler II wasn't banned because it was unsafe or poorly designed. Quite the opposite. It was too good, too specialized, and too far removed from the everyday cars NASCAR wanted to keep on its tracks. It was, in essence, a victim of its own engineering success. Number 9. The 1975 Ford Granada Ghia, a car that Ford once promoted as a kind of European-inspired compact luxury sedan, but one that ran headfirst into serious rejection when taxi companies and fleet buyers put it to the test. This rejection, in fact, became so widespread that many taxi fleets outright banned the Granada from consideration. Now, let's set the stage. By the mid-1970s, the American auto industry was still reeling from the oil crisis of 1973. Gas prices had gone up, and suddenly the traditional full-size sedans that had dominated taxi fleets, cars like the Ford LTD or the Chevrolet Impala, seemed too thirsty, too large, and too expensive to operate. Automakers sensed an opportunity. What if smaller, more efficient cars could replace them? Ford thought it had the answer with the Granada, introduced for 1975. Ford marketed the Granada as a European-style luxury compact, borrowing inspiration from BMW and Mercedes in its advertising. The Ghia trim, in particular, was meant to convey an upscale feel in a smaller package, with extra chrome, plush interiors, and a more refined ride. On paper, this sounded appealing for taxi companies who wanted something cheaper to run, yet comfortable for passengers. But here's the problem. The Granada Ghia looked the part, but it didn't perform the part. Taxi operators quickly found that the transmissions were weak and prone to early failure under the stress of stop-and-go urban driving. Automatic gearboxes that might have lasted reasonably well in private ownership simply couldn't handle the constant punishment of taxi service. Every breakdown meant lost fares, costly repairs, and downtime, things a fleet operator simply couldn't afford. Beyond the mechanical issues, the Granada Ghia was simply too cramped inside. Compared to the wide, roomy interiors of traditional full-size sedans, the Granada felt tight in the back seat. For paying passengers, especially in big cities where cabs often carried 3 or more people, the space was uncomfortable. Legroom was poor, headroom was limited, and the Ghia's upscale trim did nothing to change the fact that the car was just too small to serve as a practical taxi. Some taxi fleet trials even documented these problems in writing, noting that while the Granada might work as a family car, it was not suitable for heavy-duty commercial use. As a result, many taxi commissions and fleet managers went a step further. They formally banned the Granada from taxi use, refusing to allow operators to add them to licensed fleets. They preferred to stick with proven, larger sedans, even if they cost more in fuel, because reliability and space were ultimately more important in their line of work. So what we have here is a story of mismatched ambition. Ford tried to reposition itself as a builder of smaller, more European cars with an air of luxury. But when they pitched the Granada Ghia as a taxi fleet solution, it collapsed under real-world demands. It was too fragile, too tight, and too far removed from the durability that fleets required. In hindsight, the 1975 Ford Granada Ghia is a perfect example of how different customer segments value different qualities. Private buyers might have enjoyed its compact size, its Ghia trim luxury, and its image. But taxi operators needed durability, simplicity, and space above all else, and the Granada simply didn't deliver. And that's why it never became the taxi of the future Ford imagined. Instead, it became one of the first examples of a fleet ban in the 1970s, an official rejection by the very buyers Ford hoped to win over. Number 8. The 1974 Mercury Capri V6, a sporty little import sold under Ford's Mercury brand. On the surface, this was a car that looked like a bargain European sports coupe. But for many young buyers in America, it came with a hidden obstacle that made it nearly unattainable. Insurance companies classified it as a high-risk performance car, effectively pricing out the very audience Ford was trying to attract. Let's begin with some background. The Capri was actually a product of Ford of Europe, built in Germany and England. It was marketed in the US by Lincoln Mercury dealers as the sexy European. Its sleek, fastback styling and available 6-cylinder power made it appealing to American buyers who wanted something sporty but smaller and more efficient than a Mustang. By 1974, with the oil crisis fresh in people's minds, that seemed like a smart strategy. Now, the key to the Capri's reputation in America was the V6 version. The 2.8-liter Cologne V6 gave it far more punch than the basic four-cylinder models. This engine transformed the Capri from a commuter coupe into something that could actually keep up with Mustangs, Camaros, and even some European rivals. It wasn't a muscle car, but it delivered spirited performance with a light chassis, good handling, and respectable acceleration. For young drivers, it was the perfect mix of affordable, fun, and stylish. But here's where the trouble began. Insurance companies in the 1970s were already on high alert about fast coupes. The muscle car boom of the late 1960s had led to skyrocketing accident rates among young drivers. And by the early 1970s, insurers were aggressively recalculating their risk categories. Anything that looked like a sporty coupe, even if it wasn't a true high-horsepower muscle car, was often lumped into the same high-risk category. And that's exactly what happened to the 1974 Mercury Capri V6. Even though it was smaller, lighter, and less powerful than a Mustang, insurers classified it as a pony car or sports coupe equivalent. Premiums skyrocketed, especially for drivers under 25. In some cases, the yearly insurance bill exceeded the cost of the monthly car payments. For a car aimed at young, budget-conscious buyers, this was devastating. As a result, many of the very people Ford had in mind for the Capri, the young enthusiasts who wanted a stylish, affordable European coupe, were simply priced out. Some insurance companies even went as far as to refuse coverage altogether for high-risk age brackets on the Capri V6, effectively creating a de facto insurance ban. Now, what's interesting here is that this wasn't really about the car itself. The Capri V6 was not unsafe, nor was it excessively powerful. Compared to a Mustang Mach-1 or a Pontiac Firebird Trans Am, it was modest. But perception mattered. It had 2 doors, sporty styling, and an energetic engine, and that was enough to trigger the insurance industry's crackdown. The irony is that the Capri's 4-cylinder models didn't face the same problem. They were seen as economical and relatively tame. But of course, those versions weren't nearly as appealing. The V6 was the car enthusiasts wanted, but it was the one that insurers targeted. In hindsight, the 1974 Mercury Capri V6 highlights the broader cultural and economic shift of the mid-1970s. The muscle car era had ended not only because of government regulations and rising fuel costs, but also because of the insurance backlash. Cars didn't have to be true muscle machines to get caught in the net. Anything sporty was suspect, and the Capri V6 paid the price. So what we have is an imported Ford product that should have been a hit, and in some ways it was. It sold decently well. But its potential was held back by forces outside the control of Ford or Mercury. For many buyers, the car was affordable at the dealership but unattainable in the insurance office. And that is why the 1974 Mercury Capri V6 goes down in history as one of those cars that insurers effectively banned, even without government regulations ever touching it. Number 7. The 1979 Ford LTD Landau Coupe. Now, the LTD had long been one of Ford's bread-and-butter full-size cars. Introduced in the mid-1960s as a more luxurious trim level, by the late 1970s it had become synonymous with comfort, size, and status. The Landau Coupe was a particularly lavish version, easily identified by its padded vinyl roof, plush interior appointments, and an overall air of personal luxury. It was Ford's answer to a market that craved prestige at an affordable price. But here's where the story takes a turn. By 1979, the United States was still in the shadow of the 1973 oil crisis and was already dealing with the 1979 energy crisis. Gasoline prices had spiked, shortages had rattled consumers, and efficiency was suddenly a top priority. For private buyers, this meant downsizing to compacts or even imports. But for government agencies, state, federal, and municipal, it meant reevaluating what kinds of vehicles they purchased for their fleets. Traditionally, government fleets had relied heavily on full-size sedans like the LTD because they were durable, roomy, and practical for official duties. Police departments, highway patrols, and civil agencies all used them. But the Landau Coupe was a different story. Unlike the base LTD sedan, the Landau Coupe was designed to impress. It had features that made it heavier, thirstier, and costlier to maintain. The luxury trim, vinyl roof, plush upholstery, and even extra chrome didn't add anything to its function as a government fleet vehicle. And under the hood, the Landau Coupe carried engines that reflected the old-school American car philosophy. Large V8s that could produce smooth power, but at the expense of fuel economy. With EPA ratings often dipping into the single digits in city driving, the Landau was a symbol of everything the government was trying to move away from during a time of national energy conservation. Fleet managers quickly caught on. By the late 1970s, government fleet regulations began shifting toward more efficient, cost-effective vehicles. Many agencies began to explicitly ban Landau trim LTDs and other luxury variants from fleet bidding processes. Instead, they specified base model sedans with smaller engines, minimal trim, and lower maintenance costs. In other words, they wanted practical workhorses, not rolling status symbols. The decision wasn't just about image, it was about accountability. Taxpayers demanded that government agencies set an example during a time of fuel shortages and high costs. A fleet of thirsty Landau coupes would have been hard to justify, both politically and economically. And so, while the LTD sedan remained a staple of police departments and state motor pools, the Landau Coupe was essentially blacklisted from government use. This speaks to a broader cultural shift of the era. By 1979, personal luxury coupes, cars like the LTD Landau, Chevrolet Caprice Classic Coupe, and Chrysler New Yorker Bram, were beginning to lose favor as practical realities caught up with buyers. What was once a symbol of prosperity became, in the eyes of government agencies, a liability. So, the 1979 Ford LTD Landau Coupe stands as an example of how a car could be perfectly appealing to private buyers, those who wanted comfort, style, and a sense of prestige, but utterly rejected by institutional buyers who prioritized efficiency and cost control. In short, the very features that made the Landau Coupe attractive in the showroom made it unacceptable in the government garage. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why the Landau Coupe, despite being a fine cruiser, found itself banned from government fleets in the wake of the oil crises. Number 6. The 1980 Ford Mustang Cobra Turbo, a car that promised excitement on paper but ran headlong into the hard reality of California smog laws. Let's set the stage. By 1979, Ford had redesigned the Mustang into what we call the Fox body platform. It was smaller, lighter, and meant to compete not only with domestic rivals like the Camaro and Firebird, but also with sporty imports flooding the market. Ford's idea was to reinvent the Mustang for a new generation, one that demanded efficiency as much as performance. The solution? A turbocharged four-cylinder engine. Now remember, this was 1980. Turbocharging was still experimental in American cars. Ford took its humble 2.3-liter inline-4, added a turbo, and dropped it into the Cobra performance trim of the Mustang. On paper, it seemed brilliant, the fuel economy of a four-cylinder with the power of a small V8. It was marketed as futuristic, high-tech, and responsive to the era's energy-conscious mood. But in practice, the Cobra Turbo had issues. The carbureted turbo system was primitive by today's standards, with poor fuel control and inconsistent boost. Reliability suffered, and the promised performance often fell flat. Owners reported lag, detonation, and overheating. And then came the biggest obstacle: emissions. California had the strictest smog laws in the nation at the time, enforced by the California Air Resources Board, or CARB. Cars sold there had to pass more rigorous emissions tests than anywhere else in the country. Unfortunately for Ford, the 2.3-liter turbocharged engine simply couldn't meet those standards in its early form. The carburetor struggled to manage both performance and emissions, and the turbo's inconsistent fuel-air mix created excess pollutants. As a result, the 1980 Mustang Cobra Turbo was effectively banned from being sold in California. Dealers couldn't stock it, buyers couldn't register it, and Ford had to market the car only in the other 49 states. This wasn't unique. Several manufacturers had models that failed California certification, but for Ford, it was a particularly embarrassing blow. After all, the Cobra Turbo was supposed to showcase innovation, not regulatory failure. The California ban highlighted the tension of the era. Automakers wanted to sell excitement, but regulators demanded cleaner air. For buyers in California, the largest single car market in the United States, this meant limited choice. If you wanted a Mustang in 1980, you had to settle for the naturally aspirated four-cylinder, the inline-six, or one of the small-block V8s that had been tuned to pass emission standards. Interestingly, this episode foreshadowed the direction performance cars would take in the 1980s. Turbocharging would eventually return, better engineered, fuel-injected, and emissions-compliant. But in 1980, Ford's experiment was simply too early, too crude, and too unreliable. So, the 1980 Ford Mustang Cobra Turbo remains a reminder of the growing pains in American automotive engineering. On the one hand, it was bold, an attempt to blend performance with efficiency. On the other hand, it revealed the technical shortcomings of carbureted turbo systems under the watchful eye of regulators. And in California, it never even had a chance to prove itself, because smog laws kept it out entirely. In short, this car was a symbol of ambition colliding with reality. It wasn't just a Mustang that couldn't thrive. It was a Mustang that couldn't even cross state lines into California. Number 5. The 1984 Ford Mustang SVO. This was no ordinary pony car. It was a bold experiment, a high-tech alternative to the V8 muscle tradition, and a victim not only of timing, but also of a powerful enemy outside the auto industry, the insurance companies. Let's begin with the context. By the early 1980s, the muscle car era had fizzled. Emissions laws, fuel crisis, and skyrocketing insurance costs in the 1970s had gutted horsepower ratings. Yet enthusiasts still craved performance. Ford's Special Vehicle Operations, or SVO division, set out to build a Mustang that would combine handling, braking, and efficiency with real speed. The result was the Mustang SVO, launched in 1984. Instead of a traditional V8, Ford equipped it with a 2.3-liter turbocharged inline-four, paired with advanced features like fuel injection, an intercooler, and computer-controlled boost. This engine produced 175 horsepower, later bumped to 205, at a time when the standard 5.0 V8 Mustang was making only about 165. In fact, the SVO was the most advanced Mustang Ford had ever built up to that point. But the upgrades didn't stop at the engine. The SVO featured four-wheel disc brakes, a quicker steering rack, Coney adjustable shocks, performance tires, and unique aerodynamics with a biplane rear spoiler and a distinctive front fascia. Inside, it had sport seats, a leather-wrapped wheel, and a driver-focused cockpit. The idea was clear. This was not just a straight-line muscle car, but a sophisticated performance machine that could rival European imports like the BMW 3 Series and Porsche 944. On paper, Ford had succeeded. The Mustang SVO was quick, agile, and refined. But then came the problem: insurance companies. During this era, insurers had begun targeting high-performance models, especially those marketed to young drivers, with steep surcharges. The SVO's turbocharged engine, high horsepower rating, and sporty image all raised red flags. Despite being a four-cylinder, the SVO was classified as a high-risk coupe. For many younger buyers, precisely the demographic Ford hoped would embrace this car, insurance premiums were astronomical, sometimes higher than the car payment itself. This effectively blacklisted the SVO from its intended audience. Young enthusiasts who might have chosen it over a Camaro, Firebird, or even the Mustang GT found themselves priced out by insurance. Older, wealthier buyers, meanwhile, often gravitated toward European brands with more prestige. The result was a sales flop. Only about 10,000 SVOs were sold between 1984 and 1986. And that's the tragedy here. The Mustang SVO was ahead of its time. It anticipated the turbocharged, high-tech performance cars that would dominate decades later. But in the 1980s, it was caught in a perfect storm of market resistance, high price tags, and punitive insurance costs. The same qualities that made it appealing, turbo power, sporty image, advanced engineering, also made it a target for insurers. So, what's the legacy of the 1984 Mustang SVO? Today, enthusiasts appreciate it as a rare and innovative chapter in Mustang history. It showed that performance didn't have to mean a big block V8. But its commercial failure underscores an important lesson. Sometimes, the barriers to a car's success don't come from engineering or the factory floor, but from outside forces like insurance regulators. In short, the Mustang SVO wasn't just a car, it was a vision of the future, hampered by the realities of its time.
Number 4. The 1981 Mercury Capri RS. Though it shared much with its better-known cousin, the Ford Mustang, the Capri RS had a story of its own. A story shaped not just by engineering or styling, but by the powerful influence of insurance companies in the early 1980s. The Mercury Capri had originally arrived in America as a European import from Ford of Germany in the early 1970s. But by 1979, Mercury reintroduced the Capri as a domestic car built on the new Fox body platform, the same lightweight, versatile chassis that underpinned the third-generation Mustang. The Capri was essentially the Mercury-branded Mustang, but with slightly different styling, including unique bodywork and flared fenders, giving it a sportier, more upscale appearance. Now, the RS trim was the performance version. Buyers could equip it with Ford's legendary 5.0-liter V8, a small block that had survived the emission-strangled 1970s and was beginning to make a comeback. By 1981, horsepower ratings were modest by muscle car standards, around 175 horsepower, but in the context of the time, the Capri RS was still considered a serious performer. And that's where the trouble began. Insurance companies, still reeling from the muscle car excesses of the late 1960s and early 1970s, had grown wary of cars with V8 engines, sporty styling, and youthful buyers. The Fox body Capri RS checked every one of those boxes. It had the looks of a muscle coupe, the performance-oriented RS badge, and most importantly, the 5.0 V8 under the hood. As a result, the Capri RS was lumped into what insurers called the pony car danger zone. This classification grouped it alongside the Mustang, Camaro, and Firebird as high-risk vehicles. The statistics backed them up. These cars were disproportionately bought by young drivers, often driven hard, and overrepresented in accidents. So even though the Capri RS wasn't as fast or powerful as its 1960s predecessors, insurers treated it as if it were a fire-breathing muscle car. The consequence was sky-high insurance premiums. For younger buyers, the very market Mercury wanted to attract, coverage was either prohibitively expensive or outright denied. A teenager or 20-something could sometimes find themselves paying more for insurance than for the car itself. In effect, the Capri RS became nearly uninsurable for its intended audience. This had a chilling effect on sales. The Capri never matched the Mustang's popularity to begin with, and the RS models in particular suffered under the weight of insurance restrictions. Buyers who might have been excited by the promise of a sporty V8 Mercury often settled for a 6-cylinder version, or skipped the Capri entirely in favor of something cheaper to insure. What's important here is the broader lesson. In the early 1980s, insurance companies were just as influential as government regulators in shaping the car market. Automakers could design performance cars, but if insurers punished buyers with excessive premiums, sales would dry up. The Capri RS was caught in this trap, not because it was dangerously fast, but because of its image and association with the pony car category. Today, the 1981 Mercury Capri RS is remembered as a niche player in the Fox body family. Enthusiasts value its rarity and distinct styling compared to the Mustang, but its sales were limited by forces beyond Mercury's control. It's a reminder that sometimes a car's fate is determined not by what's under the hood, but by how the world perceives it and how much it costs to insure. In short, the Capri RS was a capable pony car with real potential. But for many young buyers, it was a dream car they simply couldn't afford to keep on the road, thanks to insurance restrictions.
Number 3. The 1980 Ford Fairmont Futura Turbo. On the surface, this might seem like an odd combination, a family sedan platform fitted with a sporty turbo engine. But the real story is how this car ran headfirst into California's increasingly strict emissions laws, and in the process showed just how difficult it was for automakers to balance performance with regulation at the dawn of the 1980s. The Fairmont, introduced in 1978, was Ford's first product on the brand-new Fox platform. It was designed to be a practical, mid-size car, affordable, roomy, and efficient compared to the bloated models of the previous decade. But Ford, like most manufacturers, was experimenting with turbocharging as a way to squeeze more power out of small, emission-strangled engines without sacrificing fuel economy. By 1980, the sporty Futura Coupe could be ordered with a 2.3-liter turbocharged four-cylinder engine. This was the same basic engine that would later appear in the Mustang Turbo and eventually evolve into the motor that powered the Mustang SVO. On paper, it was an exciting idea, a lightweight turbo coupe that offered performance without relying on a big V8. But there was one enormous problem: emissions compliance. California, which had adopted the strictest air quality standards in the nation, subjected every new car to its California Air Resources Board (CARB) regulations. The turbocharged Fairmont Futura simply couldn't pass the required tests. The technology was still primitive, with inconsistent fuel delivery, poor turbo reliability, and little ability to fine-tune emissions. As a result, the Fairmont Turbo was banned from sale in California. Now, let's pause here to understand the significance. In 1980, California wasn't just another state. It was the largest car market in the United States. To be locked out of California meant losing hundreds of thousands of potential buyers. For a niche car like the Fairmont Futura Turbo, the ban practically doomed it from the start. It's worth noting that this wasn't just a Ford problem. The late 1970s and early 1980s saw a number of turbocharged experiments from American automakers: Chevrolet's Monte Carlo Turbo, Buick's early Turbo V6, and Chrysler's Turbo 4s. All of them struggled to balance performance with emissions compliance. California's strict laws simply highlighted those weaknesses sooner than the rest of the country. The Fairmont Futura Turbo, then, was both a technical experiment and a casualty of timing. Ford wanted to prove that turbocharging could offer sporty performance in a sensible package, but the technology just wasn't mature enough to meet California's clean air demands. Sales outside of California were minimal, and the car disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. What makes this story important is the broader lesson. Regulations often shaped the direction of automotive technology just as much as consumer demand. In the Fairmont's case, emissions laws killed the car before the public could even decide whether it wanted one. Ironically, just a few years later, advances in fuel injection and computer controls made turbocharging viable, leading to successes like the Mustang SVO and the Thunderbird Turbo Coupe. But in 1980, the Fairmont Futura Turbo was ahead of its time and, at the same time, hopelessly behind in technology. It remains a rare and forgotten oddity, remembered mostly by enthusiasts as one of the first casualties of California's war on smog.
So, in conclusion, the 1980 Ford Fairmont Futura Turbo shows us how innovation, when paired with immaturity in engineering and strict regulation, can lead to a very short-lived chapter in automotive history. It wasn't the performance that killed it, it was California. Number 2. The 1983 Ford Mustang GT 5.0, a car that marked the triumphant return of V8 power to the Mustang line, but also fell victim to a very different kind of restriction, not from the government, not from racing authorities, but from the insurance industry. To set the stage, we need to go back a few years. In the mid-1970s, after the oil crisis and tightening emission standards, the Mustang had lost its way. The once mighty muscle pony car was watered down into the Mustang II, small, underpowered, and widely ridiculed. By the end of the decade, Ford knew it needed to bring performance back to its flagship. Enter the Foxbody Mustang, introduced in 1979. By 1982, Ford brought back the 5.0-liter V8 and gave the Mustang its soul again. The real turning point came in 1983 with the Mustang GT 5.0. With a 175 horsepower V8, 4-barrel carburetor, and aggressive styling, it was fast, affordable, and exactly what enthusiasts had been waiting for. It could outrun far more expensive European cars, all while costing thousands less. But here's where the story takes a twist. The insurance industry, still reeling from the carnage of the late 1960s and early 1970s muscle car era, had already developed a system for identifying high-risk vehicles. Any car with a big engine in a small body, especially a two-door coupe aimed at younger drivers, was treated as a red flag. The 1983 Mustang GT 5.0 fit that description perfectly. Insurance companies began slapping surcharges on the car, sometimes doubling or even tripling premiums for drivers under 25. In some cases, companies simply refused to insure young buyers altogether. This blacklist effect wasn't unique to Ford. The Camaro Z28, Firebird Trans Am, and other pony cars faced the same treatment. But because the Mustang GT was priced to attract younger enthusiasts, the insurance penalties hit particularly hard. Many buyers who could afford the monthly payment on the car itself found themselves unable to cover the cost of insuring it. The irony is that the Mustang GT wasn't nearly as wild as the muscle cars of the late 60s. By modern standards, 175 horsepower seems modest. But perception mattered. The combination of 5.0 badging, V8 rumble, and performance marketing was enough to put insurers on alert. The result was that the 1983 Mustang GT 5.0 became a victim of its own success. It was too good, too tempting, and too affordable for young drivers, and the insurance industry acted as an invisible regulator, limiting who could realistically buy one. Yet, in the bigger picture, this backlash only added to the Mustang's legend. The fact that it was considered too hot to insure gave it an outlaw reputation. For those who managed to get behind the wheel, it cemented the Mustang as the reborn muscle machine of the 1980s. And for Ford, the GT 5.0's popularity proved that performance had a permanent place in the Mustang lineup, something that continues to this day. So, to conclude, the 1983 Mustang GT 5.0 wasn't banned by lawmakers or racing authorities. It was banned by economics. Insurance surcharges became the barrier that separated dreamers from drivers. And in doing so, the GT 5.0 became not just a car, but a symbol of the tug-of-war between performance, affordability, and the hidden costs of driving something fast. Number 1. The 1984 Ford EXP Turbo. It was a small, sporty two-seater that promised excitement for younger buyers, yet it quickly ran into a wall not of engineering, but of economics. Insurance companies effectively banned it by classifying it as a high-risk performance car. The Ford EXP, introduced in 1982, was essentially a sporty spin-off of the Escort. It was marketed as a personal coupe, a modern-day attempt at the Thunderbird idea, only scaled down for the new era of economy cars. Unlike the Escort, the EXP had only 2 seats, a sleeker body, and was pitched toward young singles who wanted style on a budget. By 1984, Ford decided to spice things up with the EXP Turbo. Under the hood sat a 1.6-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder making around 120 horsepower, a big jump compared to the base model. For a car that weighed less than 2,400 pounds, this was enough to make it genuinely quick for its time. With a 5-speed manual transmission, sporty trim, and aggressive graphics, the EXP Turbo was Ford's way of saying, "Here's a fun little rocket for young drivers who can't afford a Mustang." But here's where the trouble began. Insurance companies in the early 1980s had become highly suspicious of cars that looked even remotely sporty. After years of dealing with high accident rates among young drivers in Camaros, Mustangs, and Firebirds, the industry created a system that flagged cars with certain traits: 2 doors, small size, turbocharging, and marketing aimed at youth. The EXP Turbo checked every one of those boxes. Despite the fact that it wasn't overwhelmingly powerful, certainly not compared to a Mustang GT or Camaro Z28, the EXP Turbo was blacklisted. Insurers either slapped steep surcharges on policies or outright refused coverage for younger drivers. For a car that cost less than $9,000 brand new, monthly insurance premiums could sometimes rival the car payment itself. This meant the EXP Turbo, rather than becoming an affordable sports coupe for the masses, was priced out of reach for the very audience Ford had targeted. Sales remained low, and the car developed a reputation not as a hot hatch alternative, but as a financial headache. The irony here is rich. Ford had engineered the EXP Turbo to be fun, but still sensible, a lightweight, fuel-efficient 2-seater with just enough power to feel lively. Yet insurance companies treated it as if it were a full-blown muscle car. In reality, it was far from dangerous. Its handling and braking were better than most economy cars of the era. But classification mattered more than capability, and so the EXP Turbo was punished for its image rather than its performance. The broader story this tells us is about how the insurance industry effectively acted as an unofficial regulator during the 1980s performance revival. Even modest cars like the EXP Turbo got caught in the dragnet if they looked too sporty or carried a turbo badge. It's a reminder that in the automotive world, it's not just what the engineers design or what the marketers promote, it's also what the insurance companies decide they're willing to underwrite. So, in conclusion, the 1984 Ford EXP Turbo wasn't banned by law, wasn't banned by emissions regulators, and wasn't banned by racing authorities. Instead, it was banned by economics. Its youth-focused image, turbocharged engine, and 2-seat layout made it an insurance pariah. And that, perhaps more than anything, sealed its fate as one of Ford's forgotten, sporty experiments of the 1980s.